And we're on. Hello, world. My name is Shane Pokroy, and this is episode 3 of Underground Antics. Welcome back. I wanted to start off today by just firstly saying thank you to everyone who's been supporting, this podcast. It really means a lot to me, and, obviously there's no podcast if there's no audience and people supporting it, and I'm glad and I hope to be able to provide content worthy of, your support. And yeah, just a huge thank you to everyone. It really means a lot. If anyone is interested in supporting the podcast, you can go to patreon.com/underground antics. There'll be a link in the description. That way you can contribute, which would be amazing. I'll also be taking questions and ideas in the next few episodes, and so if you want to get in on that, shoot me an email at shane@undergroundantics.com. And, we can talk about anything you want. I'm open to ideas. You can also comment on YouTube or Spotify or iTunes or wherever you are, listening to this. I'd love to hear what your thoughts are and see what's going, through people's minds right now. But in the meantime, for today, I wanted to start off this podcast by talking about this book that I recently read. And it's called The Hidden Messages in Water by a Japanese guy named Masaru Emoto. And this dude just did some amazing stuff with water. What he did was he would take different water samples and freeze them and take a picture of the crystals that form of the water as they freeze, right? I'm not sure exactly what the instruments were that he used, but that's how he did it. And then what he proceeded to do was to do various experiments with water and then take pictures to see how things would change, or if they would change in terms of the crystallization. And, what he found was really, it was remarkable. He basically, you can change something about water through music, and this could be in a good or a bad way. So actually, what he found was if he played, very sort of wholesome classical music like Beethoven or what do they call those things? Symphonies like that. The crystals would become much more perfect in the treated water. And, they would take on different shapes depending on the song. And it's really cool. And then, if you get into any of the aggressive stuff, then the crystals deform or none form at all, And, we'd known weird stuff like this in the past. They know that plants grow better to classical music, and people don't really understand that, and we don't understand that at all, really. But it's just so crazy because we're made up of 70-ish% water, and so it's possible. What this guy's saying is that the way that we are interacting with the world, a lot of it's happening through everything that we're not consciously aware of, so people speaking or what you listen to, what you're exposed to, by choice or not, unfortunately not by choice, they have an actual impact on the makeup of our system, which isn't really surprising when you think about it. I mean, that's what happens when someone walks into a room and all of a sudden there's just this big energy shift or something like that, where something's changed and it's quite hard to pinpoint. And I guess if you practice, you can get better at attuning to it and figuring out exactly what that means. But something about them communicated with something in you that made you feel a certain way, and you felt it, and that's how it presented in consciousness. It didn't present as a thought of this is what's happening. It's more I have a feeling about this. And so, yeah, what he would also do is he would show and say words to the water, and they would form different crystals depending on whether they were positive or negative sayings. And like really remarkable stuff. I mean, if you just Google it, you can see the pictures. You have to see it for yourself, really, to understand the majesty of what he's done. Because look, he tried to stick to the current scientific method as much as he could. But we unfortunately haven't reached a place where we can control for things like energy or consciousness or mental energy. Like, I don't even really know how to express it, but that type of influence on something. And so to control for it's like very difficult. And he goes into it in the book about, how he tried to control for it as best he could. And he would use, I think, like 50 samples of each experiment that he was doing for accuracy purposes, and to see if there was, that it wasn't just random. And he implemented some control measures. But, ultimately what he found was like, people could change the actual structure of water just by concentrating their thoughts at it. And he did, and anyone can do it, because he was like doing it. He did it with kids, and they were like, having fun with it. And so what, like trying to control for that would be crazy, because you would have to like obviously do the double blind stuff, but you would also have to make sure that the person who's conducting the test isn't thinking at that time in order to influence the water, but you can't do that. And so, I'm not saying it's a perfectly scientific discovery, but it's something really worth considering and taking seriously. I mean, like, I don't even know all of the implications of what it would mean. There's water is everything, and everyone knows water is life. I mean, that's just, you run out of water in a couple days, you'll be dead. Anything living basically ends up that way without water. Not everything, but a lot of things. And so, I mean, yeah, that means, the observer effect in science is already a known phenomenon. It's not very well understood, but they know that observing the experiment changes the result. And they know this particularly true at the like quantum level, where things get super funky and weird, and like particles can exist in two places at the same time, and weird, crazy stuff like that. And so even like physics notes that the observer effect is an actual situation, like it's a problem, not just with water. This is actually just with like, it doesn't matter what you're observing, but the observer has an influence. And so you're at all times essentially partly creating the world around you, because you're projecting energy and or whatever you want to call consciousness, or whatever you want to call it. You're projecting it to everything around you, and so you're partially creating that. But and you're influencing other people, and people can influence you, and so it's we're not very aware of it. It just sort of happens. I think typically in like, well, I don't want to speak for everyone, but like as I see it, people have like, they tend to want to distinguish between thoughts and feelings, because there's like a distinction in your consciousness of feelings and thoughts, and I'm not exactly sure why that is, but it is nevertheless. And what we're usually not very good at is understanding or managing our emotions. And when we don't do that, we end up with all sorts of issues, and trying not to feel our emotions and whatever, and it manifests differently in different people depending on your genetics, and that has a huge component in it. And people get into different activities to manage it, and or like substance use, or any number of things. People are just sort of trying to like manage their emotions in their lives as like a primary focus, is just to feel less pain. There was an expression that I read of something about like, we're all wounded warriors walking the line, where everyone's suffering something and we're all in it together. I don't want to get too much off track. I want to get back to the water thing. Sorry, jumping around. But what it led me to think about was like plant consciousness. Well, not just plant, but like consciousness in general. And how there seems to be a continuum of consciousness from whatever the bottom is to whatever the top is, which may not be us. It may be things that are way more self-conscious and aware of how things work. Like that's what we're doing, is we're trying to figure it out. But yeah, so like I was thinking that the distinction between like plant and animal gets kind of blurry at points. And that's really strange to think about. But usually things that we attribute to living things, you can kind of attribute to plants as well, but like not totally. But it's not exactly clear, why some things are alive and some things aren't, like organic and inorganic matter, as they say. They've sort of conceptualized it that there's like some stuff's alive and some's not. And I mean, my opinion on the matter is that I think that everything is fundamentally made up of the same stuff, like whatever it is. And, the totality of everything is made up of the same thing. And you can sort of like break it down as much as you want. They sort of used to think it was atoms that made up everything. And then it sort of went lower down to the subatomics. And, I think currently the leading theory is like that vibration is the underlying cause of everything, or at least one of them. And so when things start happening, there's increasing levels of what we call consciousness, which is like awareness or attention, that develops as things become more and more complex, I guess you could say. So, like basic organisms have like the least amount of consciousness, if any, and then things like rocks have like that, or a table or things like that, and they seem to be not alive and whatever, particularly if we craft it, like it's not. And then the next step up would be let's say plants. And we know that plants act in really weird ways. They communicate with each other. They adapt. They support the weak in certain plant networks. They can survive for who knows, like how long. That they're sort of the ultimate survivalists. I mean, nature just overruns anything with trees and plants and vines and all that kind of stuff. Anywhere that's been abandoned or destroyed, like nature finds a way to creep in and grow some shit. There's crazy things of like trees growing on the top of buildings because it grew like through the building. And whatever, you can look at like old abandoned cities and things like that, and you can see it in a matter of weeks. It's like overrun by green stuff. And so we typically don't want to say that those things have consciousness, because it is kind of weird to say that, to think about it like that. But we know that they respond to consciousness sometimes. Like their growth, the level or how well they grow depends on things, or not depends, but is, influenced by like music, for example. And that's been known since back in the day. I can't even remember what the dude's name was who studied that stuff, but he played different kinds of music and found that plants flourish when listening to certain kinds of music, like classical music, which is the same sort of music that this guy played to the water. And so something's happening there, right? And then, I don't know enough about the evolution of like animals to know like where there's overlap, if any, with like plant stuff. I mean, I know that there's probably some, because current evolutionary theories, like there was no plants on Earth, and then there were plants, and then after the plants there were animals. So and then after the animals, or at the end of the animals, up until now, there's us, the weird creatures that we are. But plants were the beginning sort of things. I think I hope I'm right about that. I think I am, but feel free to give it a Google. So then different kinds of animals have different levels of consciousness, obviously too, depending on their developmental process. Like, fish, for example, with basic neurological structures have less. Actually, well, so here's the thing, right? If we're going to attribute consciousness to plants, then we have to reevaluate like why we're considering certain animals more or less conscious, not based on like the nervous system, because plants don't have a nervous system. I mean, they have a distribution system, but it's not the same as the typical like animal anatomy. I wish I had an expert on here who could sort of give us the lowdown on what that's about. But something's going on, right? And so there's just different levels of consciousness, and there's different states of it even within people. Like when you're in a mood, like what do you think's happening at that point? Yeah, I mean, you can say, oh, certain chemicals are being released, and this is why they're being released, and whatever, and then the mood's kind of just what it feels like. All right, fair enough, but why? That's so bizarre, and it doesn't take away from the fact that you can't get rid of moods. People just go through them for some reason, and your mood is influenced a lot of times, but not all the time maybe, by internal and external factors. And it's not always clear how those things affect you, but they do, and they affect you in a major way. I mean, you see the world differently when you're in different like frames of mind, mood states. Not exactly see the world differently, but you sort of do. I mean, obviously you're seeing the same world, but you're seeing a version of it like with filters on it. And you can take a step back and know that you're filtering and sort of step out of that. But a lot of the times the emotion or the mood's so powerful that it just grabs your attention and it doesn't let go. And so you don't really have a choice in that. And so that's just how you see things. And there's nothing you can do about it. I mean, that also applies to, like, I would say beliefs and, other fundamental cognitive structures. But here's another thing that's really awesome. I recently learned about this thing called the Ebers Papyrus. And what it is it's the oldest known medical like textbook of, sort of human history. And it dates back to 2,500 years ago. So that's like 1500 BCE. It's Egyptian, and it's like 150 pages long, and it weighs like 30 kilograms or something like that. And in it contains amazing, what would have been medicine of that time. It's obviously not the biomedicine of today, but they were treating people. They knew about all these conditions, and they, there were obviously people who were sort of like specialists in it. And what's crazy about that is whether they were right or wrong about the things is irrelevant, because it's not irrelevant, but the point is a civilization has to be pretty damn advanced to have like medical textbooks. Like the level of collective consciousness has to be pretty advanced, and we for some reason don't usually think about ancient civilizations as pretty advanced. We think about them as very primitive, and I think that's a mistake to think about it like that. I think they were primitive in some aspects, but not necessarily in the good aspects. I mean, it's not clear that life today is, that, from an experiential perspective, necessarily better than it was back in the day. It's certainly different. I mean, the way we live now is very different, and it's all new, and yeah, it's all progressing. Like it's progress, and the pendulum swings back and forth with certain things, and we make our way forwards, and whatever. But like, the ancient people weren't primitive. They were hunter-gatherers, maybe, but even so, like, there were primitive primitive markets and marketplaces and things like that, where some people would do like all the hunting, and some people would do all the gathering, and then they'd sort of like have an economy of trade. And then there were people who could be freed up to specialize in things like medicine and astronomy, and all different kinds of things. Back in the day, the body of knowledge was sort of much less dispersed in sort of general terms than it is today. There was less of it, and it was less available to the average person, let's say, maybe. But, today we sort of like think of things in isolation. Like we think of like biology as being different than physics, or then psychology, or neurology, or whatever, or medicine, for example, or and whatever, and anything. And so we think of them as separate because there's so much information in each of those areas that people spend their whole lives focused on improving the knowledge of that particular area. And so it does separate, obviously, because no one can hold that kind of information, all of it, but what happens is we sort of like tend to just we forget that they're the same thing. They're just different ways of looking at the same thing, and to not take a holistic approach to everything is to miss aspects of it, like when people treat psychological conditions, there's always physiological parts to it as well. It's not, and it's because it's the same thing. It's like your structures are everywhere inside of you, and sometimes they get injured and broken and they need fixing. But they can't be approached as like individual things. They can, but it's, you miss the whole picture when you do that. And obviously I think we're getting better at it. Like the people who are in practice there's a lot of very smart people who have holistic approaches to things, obviously. And, it's not necessarily a mistake per se to focus on one area, but it's just less optimal than if you sort of broadened your horizons a little bit. And so, yeah, I just, I've been spending time thinking about like what life must have been like in Egypt 2,500 years ago, or 5,000 years ago, or, there's new evidence that there were human civilizations like 30,000 years ago. That's so long ago. We sort of like have this idea that history only really started recently, but it didn't. We have kind of cut out, and maybe that's just because of a lack of awareness that those things were even there, right? Because they're new developments in archaeology and in whoever studies those sorts of fields, Egyptology and whatever, where they're discovering new things that present new information that inform us better, like the whole thing that was happening with the Sphinx, where they've recently done an analysis of the erosion of the Sphinx, and it turns out that it dates way back than what the Egyptologists had previously thought of as when it was created, but it actually probably a few thousand years before that. And these time periods just sort of like have disappeared, and It's interesting to think about. And, we think of them, as like, I think it's impossible for us to imagine what life would have felt like for them, because it's just so different. It's like what happens when you go to another culture that's so different from your own. You get that like culture shock phenomenon, and you can get over it, and that's awesome, and I'm not saying culture shouldn't exist. It obviously should, but you can't really understand it unless you're in it, is what I'm trying to say. And so to have the mentality of being a person in that day, it's almost even like 100 years ago, like it's hard to imagine what things would have been like, just because it's such a different world. I don't know, maybe it's just me. I have shitty memories, so maybe I just don't have that capacity, but whatever. It's a crazy world that we live in at the moment, and I think that everybody needs to remember that we're all on the same team. People argue and they fight and whatever, but it's all love. We're all in it together. Humanity is one thing, and we forget that sometimes, and we're too quick to take ourselves apart, I think. And like, I'm not saying that those things don't exist. They obviously do. That's why there's problems, but we can fix them together. And I think that it's important to remember that, like, we've survived, catastrophic events as a species, like in the past, floods and all sorts of real crazy shit, war and famine and disease and all that kind of stuff. Like, we've sort of made it through that, and so we'll get through this weird period that we're sort of going through now. However long it takes, that's how long it takes, and everyone kind of just needs to just do their best. And if their best is just, surviving through, then so be it. You do what you got to do to survive. It's how we're wired. It's how it's going to be. So I will be starting interviewing this week, hopefully, with some guests. It'll be relaxed. It'll be chilled. I'm going to have different people on to discuss these kinds of topics. If you're interested, subscribe everywhere or wherever. Subscribe wherever you listen. You can listen on iTunes and Spotify and anywhere you get podcasts, pretty much. And I also post up on YouTube if anyone's interested in watching the video. There'll be a video as well. Just search for Underground Antics, or I'll put some links in the description of whatever's being posted. But other than that, thank you for tuning in. And we'll be back soon. Take it easy.